You are listening to the fourth story for the Clarkesworld magazine podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Kate Baker. Welcome to Scion by Thomas Haw. This story, like all of our stories, are brought to you by your support. So thank you if you've gone to patreon.com/Clarkesworld. Thank you if you've chucked a few bucks our way via donation. And thank you if you've hit that subscribe button. We cannot do this without you. We cannot bring you these words and worlds without your ongoing support. Thank you for joining us for a little escapism. And I do hope that you're doing as well as can be, all things considered. Now, our author, Thomas Haw, is a Nebula, Ignite, Hugo, Locus, and Shirley Jackson award-nominated writer of speculative short fiction. You can find his work in Clarkesworld, Lightspeed magazine, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and Weird Horror magazine, among other publications. His work has also appeared in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and the year's Best Dark Fantasy and Horror. His debut short story, Uncertain Suns and Other Stories, is available at Undertow Publications and wherever books are sold. Thomas grew up in Honolulu and, after a decade plus of living in the Northeast, now resides in Los Angeles with his family. And if you like what you hear, you can go back to In My Country, The Sort, The Brotherhood of Montague Street Video, and The Mub. So, my dear listener, I hope that you can sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. Unknown compartment. There is no door where there should be a door, no hall where there should be a hall. The house has reconfigured itself again, and I find myself before an alcove instead of the outer calyx anciente. The manifold shifting of the concentric corridors and the dark disarray throughout the manor, it all reflects his mind and its worsening state. And I know, as I should have known well before this night, that my father is unraveling faster than anticipated. Where is he, Isa? One of the disembodied sculpture heads affixed to the upper moldings shifts its eyes, and she speaks with marked distortion. The Levin Lord generates, so we anticipate. Severe storms. Lee, Sapphire, Simpson, Mark, C3 to C4. I would recommend returning to your room, my lord. There's a crackle above the glass ceiling panes that illuminates the cloud bodies, and a brilliant serpentine pattern erupts crosswise through Rye's churning stratosphere. I imagine the light bursting beyond the edge of our island, and over the swelling waves of the Brazos Ocean, terminating somewhere at the darkening skyline when a deep boom shakes the creaking walls and dusty fixtures beside me. There was no notice. I hesitate. Something happened, but the sculptor is unwilling or perhaps at this point unable to formulate a response. I know, of course, the answer and what I must do, just as well as I know that he will be furious if I seek him out within the heart of the house, at the Stigma Solar, where he's undoubtedly engrossed in the developing throes of the storm. But despite my father's wishes and the years and distance he's placed between us, I can't leave him to his isolation, not with what I've now seen of the house in its present condition. Along the lower edge of my gird belt, I feel for the shape of the flagon and one of the pouches and contemplate how best to proceed, while listening to the rain pounding in sheets against the ceiling panes. A sound that frightened me in boyhood because I often imagined thousands of invisible hands banging urgently at the glass. But the time for cowering in the solitude of my chambers is over. Isa, show me the way to my father's. I find myself seizing when I realize something I've missed. At the end of the corridor behind me, well nestled in the darkness, something watches from the corner opposite the alcove, without the slightest movement. And the sconces, which should be bathing the bridging passageway with gentle light, sit in dull shadow, while the walls rattle from the bluff winds. Who are you? I call. But the little thing does not answer and continues to stand like one of Isa's sculptures. Who's there? Again, nothing. You'll answer when spoken to. Answer me. Answer. And here, I must admit, the little thing does finally respond, not with words, but in a way that makes certain this isn't some serving person or sheltering inhabitant of the manse. It moves faster than I think something of that size should be able, racing low and along the floorboards with the intensity of an animal preparing to overtake prey. The creature screams when I shut the alcove door between us, an unnerving sound like nothing I've heard before, and I lean with all my weight against the wood, feeling every jostle from the other side as I slide the inner bolt in place. I draw back and take a moment to inspect the walls about me and realize there are no meaningful passages from the compartment other than the one I just sealed. "My lord, down here." The whisper comes from one of the metal registers along the lower part of the room, and through the patterned grating I see shimmering eyes. Outstretched fingers gently push the covering aside, and a hunched shape reaches out from within the cavity. To safety. A hand, finned at the wrist, emerges from below to draw me in. I hear splintering grain behind me with wails spilling in from the fractured doorway, just as I clasp the hand with trepidation and follow, somewhere, into the hollows of the house. Stoma shafts. I had heard stories of these throughways, old areas of our house that separated the inner and outer calyx that were designed mostly to remove moisture. The aisle, man's, is often damp, given its proximity to the shore cliffs. Still, it was something else to crawl on my hands and knees through what had only been a vague abstraction, through soot clouds and curtains of web sticking to my cheeks and brow. When my father still oversaw my instruction, before he'd programmed Isa to act as an intermediary, he'd shown me the charcoal renderings of the various areas of the manor, or one possible configuration of it, I suppose. The walls of the enceinte, then the inner rings in succession, comprised of hundreds of interchangeable and alterable rooms, and then my father's solar, at the very center of the manor. I'd noticed strange lines between some of the edges of certain compartments and asked if perhaps those hash marks were to indicate areas that were somehow broken. Not broken. Passages that, in their own way, allow the man's to respirate, you see? Here. 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 His fingers, still separate from each other and functional in those days, moved across the salt-stained papers as he directed my attention. So that means they must remain proximate to the exterior, I reasoned, even as other parts of the house transition or realign. I only glanced slyly from the corner of my eye, but could tell that my father was pleased with my induction. He hadn't even noticed that I'd moved to sit on his lap to study the diagrams laid out upon the davenport. I still remember because of how close he allowed me to be. Reliving the memory, I appreciate that I must still be close to the enceinte. And if I'm to reach the solar, which, like the stoma, remains fixed no matter how the house reconfigures, I'll soon need to discern whether we're traversing an inward shaft toward the center or being redirected to the periphery. But my companion, the one to pull me into the ventricular passages, will not stop shuffling into the darkness long enough to discuss. Safety is of preeminence, she repeats whenever I try to broach the subject of our destination. And as my vision gradually acclimates to the dimness of the dust-layered shafts, I better see, when she turns to address me, the glint of eyes slightly brighter than my own, an aqueous skin reflecting some of that ambient glow across high cheekbones. But it's her garments, more than anything, that draw my attention, particularly the claret fabric of the robes, which indicates the retainer class of the Sioux folk of the house. Do I know you? I ask more as a formality than a true question. With so few visitors to my compartments, I remember each in detail long after they're gone. No, my lord, I don't believe so, though you may have seen my sister retainers from time to time. She turns where the shaft splits and chooses a passage, less because she knows where it leads, I think, and more because she thinks it will take us farther from the alcove we've departed. We need to get our bearings. It's very important that I access my father's solar. Do you know the path to the center of the house with the current alignment of the compartments? Or your sisters? Would one of them know, perhaps? The retainer speaks softly. I'm not sure who still remains, my lord. She begins to describe the same disorder of the evening as I'd experienced, but from a separate part of the Mons. The failing lights, the beginnings of the storms, the absence of my father's mind from the systemic routines. Then that little creature. She says many of the sister retainers had been penned in one of the parlors when the thing came upon them, much as it did me, and I assume her pauses are attempts to suppress the memories of the violence that followed. I sense that she wants to know how this was allowed to occur, how something so hostile had penetrated the safeguards of my father's home, and, above all, the question she dares not give words. What is happening to the Levin Lord? The longer she speaks, the more I suspect that she does not intend to lead me anywhere, that perhaps she means only to hide in these back shafts, to wait out the danger of the creature or the failures in the house systems. And as her unfocused panic grows palpable, I know what I do next is overly forceful, or from her perspective, cruel. But I also know I'll need her attention if we're to proceed. I bring forth my ghost. I draw it up, its heat and its sparking field, out from where it resides deep within my abdominal ichor, where my Levinite hearts shudder and convulse. And the ghost currents surge, they pulse and they expand, electrical energy bleeding amorphously from the surface of my muscle tissue, crackling into the surrounded ductwork and enveloping both our bodies and conducting through nearby metal. The retainer's Sue eyes, which calibrate within the light spectrum to see more detail of the ghost's glare than I ever will, fill with tears as she prostrates herself, trembling in either pain or fear. And then, when I think her appropriately subdued and willing to assist, I withdraw the field around my body and seal it once again, and the Levinite organs made to contain its energies. As I said, it's very important that I access the solar. Do you understand? The Sioux woman has difficulty breathing, but she confirms with the slightest nod. Praise be his light, everlasting. She wipes her eyes and doesn't speak for several minutes, but thereafter, when recovered, she approaches a nearby metal register, which leads back into the house's interior. Much to my relief, when we go through it, we emerge in a connecting passage with rooms to either side. Isa, I call out. I need the shortest compartment route to the solar. Advise. Can you hear me, Isa? Advise, Isa. But all I detect or perhaps imagine is the slight hum and snap of distortion under the din of wind and rain, and I do my best to conceal my concern. I turn to one of the doors in the passage when my companion stops me, her face still tear-stained. She points next to the doorframe and then raises a finger to her lips, and now I see a slight carving in the nearby panel of some kind of animal, perhaps a dog. Before I have the chance to ask about the meaning of the symbol, the retainer leads me to the opposite end of the passage and checks the other doorframe, where there are 3 rectangles scraped in the grain. She then removes the claret capelet and hood from her shoulders and requests I wear it. They may think you Sioux-like when covered, given our resemblance, she whispers, and that statement alone would stun me if not for the one that follows. It may be better for you in here, if you are not known to be a lord. Library Market. When I was growing up, I was permitted a few playmates in the house, now and again, Sioux children who, during the cold season on Rye, might come from the workers' quarters to spend some time with me. I remember, too, an elderly Sioux woman who visited when I was very young, then less and less often over the years. She was gentle and smelled of something familiar and floral. Beyond that, my companions were largely archived clips and historical recordings. Sometimes I sat with phonographs imitating the accents and dialects from the house materials, in low voices and high, over and over again. Other times I'd have Isa blare the recordings through her speakers, almost to the point of deafening everyone in the vicinity, with the simple command, Isa, proem. And if the Sioux children happened to be about, we would make a game of shouting back the words with strange cadence and emphasis. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Your work is of great value to us. Your work is of great value to us. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. My mind summons the words as a kind of familiar defense, I think, because the library market overwhelms me with crashes of movement and sound. Bodies of Sioux folk press, push, and group at makeshift stalls where study desks once were arranged. Other Sioux men and Sioux women stroll through the aisles of reference books and atlases, casually touching some of the thicker spines. There are more than several small fire pits burning throughout the dark, with dozens of figures encircling holes that are dug into the floorboards. Hundreds upon hundreds of shimmering eyes in the shadows, all of the Sioux folk having evacuated the settlements across the island, now packed into this large compartment. I've never seen so many together like this, and I feel sweat on my brow and a kind of burning and tightness in my chest. I look upward to the high vaulted ceilings, the arches and panes, to distract myself. And with each lightning strike flashing across the black sky, I observe the ripples of Sioux folk, their crowds stopping in place and their eyes brightening momentarily as they touch their foreheads in symbolic worship of my father and his storms. The sister retainer must sense my discomfort with the masses moving about because she takes my arm and leads me around the outer edge of the crowd, where all kinds of conversations swell in the air. Long and Cloudseer say a 3-day blow, someone mutters. 6th in as many months without an announcement before rainfall. Something must be. Market's real close to one of Biku's rooms, so be careful what... The sister retainer leaves me at a bench and goes looking for someone who can help locate the solar. I struggle in the meantime, without success, to limit my senses and narrow my focus where possible. Nearby, a vicar, garbed in black, perches atop a book tower and holds a dangling thurible in one hand, while raising a jagged fragment of fulgurite with the other before a gathering of kneeling Sioux folk. And so, the Antiquator, the greatest of the 11 lords, returned from Rye's hells with endless fusillades to stoke the celestial pyres. His vengeance sprang, immolating the heavens, and rising their wings and limbs and bloodied bodies. And so, we offer thanks for the light. For the light, the congregation repeats, barely audible over the tumult of market talk. We offer thanks for the cloudfall. For the cloudfall. We offer thanks for Ruko, the father of seas. The father of seas. At some point, I failed to notice an old Sioux man with a wisp of a beard taking a seat at the bench beside me. He tries to hand me a bowl of seaweed broth, heavily encrusted with roasted salt, but I decline politely and lower my head. The elderly Sioux man tries to give me the heel of a salt-bread loaf as well, but I thank him and decline a second time. From his weathered xanthus capote, it's evident that he's with the harvesters. Sioux folk I've watched from the windows of the outer enceinte, laboring down at the shifting shore. Hours each day, they're there, raking the salt ponds where spillover from the tides collects, eventually evaporating, leaving heaps of crystalline dregs. I'd marvel at the body-sized baskets they'd haul up the cliffs, over to our house's processing repositories, where the load would be cleaned of salt fleas and made comestible by our filters, again and again, each day until sundown without pause. They don't usually pray this way during the storms. The Sioux man acts as though we're continuing some casual conversation that I'm not aware we've started. Growing nervous, though, because everyone's saying, the 11 lords getting sicker, forgetting himself, us coming apart slowly, like his father did before him. I can feel the elderly Sioux man watching my hood, my shoulders, for movement. Yes, well, he has had bouts of illness like this before, I reply. He'll come through. The Sioux man drinks the broth and chews the soft blades. And if he doesn't, he seems to wait and then gives me a strange and kindly smile. You don't remember me, he says. And so I look at the elder again, at least as directly as I dare without leaning out from the hood, but nothing about the Sioux man strikes me as particularly familiar. It's possible he served in my compartments for a time, but my father always made sure to change retainers regularly, supposedly to keep me from getting attached to any one companion. So it's difficult to say. I suppose it makes no difference whether I, in fact, know the Sioux man or whether he's mistaken, because we're interrupted by someone, a harvester who says he's spoken with the sister retainer, and that I should follow him if I intend to find the solar. So I thank the elder for his generosity and depart for the nearby stairwell with my escort. The old one shouts something to me then, something that I can't clearly discern with the passing crowd. It sounds like your work is of great value to us. Almost exactly in the cadence and tone I remember from the old phonograph when I was younger, I think. The only people I shared the recording with were the Sioux children, so I have no idea how this old man would know anything about it. I must have been mistaken about what he said or otherwise have confused the sounds, I decide. I suppose I have no way of ever knowing for certain. Izanami's reading room. The upstairs library room, situated just above the far side of the main gallery, seems unusual to me at first glance. The desks and shelves have been emptied of books, and in their place a variety of machinery lies assembled about the furniture and clustered toward the back wall. The workers have lit dozens of flickering votives and tapers to make things visible, albeit barely. With the weak candlelight, I observe an odd-looking apparatus I've never seen before, like a centrifuge with mechanized appendages, and nearby an unusual octagonal box that a Sioux man quickly covers with a ragged sheet. My attention is drawn more, however, to a portrait on one of the walls, a digital oilwork of a Sioux woman in a silken ceremonial dress that seems almost matrimonial. Her expression, which seems vaguely familiar, is strangely calming to me, and in her hands she holds a species of cosmid lotus. I spend my time waiting and studying the portrait closely. 4 Sioux men in xanthus cloaks invite me to settle at a central table. And the man who escorted me here knows that the sister retainer will be with us shortly, though I realize they have shut the door. The tallest among them appears to have been leading a discussion of some sort. Trun, they call him, his shimmering eyes noticeably more alert than the others. We're honored to have you with us, Trun says to me, and we know, of course, of your intention to reach the Levin Lord in the heart of the manor. I can't help but notice an unusual cadence and strength in his voice that I have not often encountered in the salt workers. His accent, too, is closer to the retainers, with some hallmarks of formal education. There is, we believe, a terminal very close by that we may be able to operate with the house's latent power. That well may show the current alignment of the manor at this point in time, including a viable path to the solar at its center. But if we may be so impetuous as to inquire, what will the young lord do if he's able to access the Levin Lord's compartment? I'm reluctant to give an answer, but I suspect that being forthright might gain me some advantage. There is an old trick I remember, one the Levinites occasionally use, a slight manipulation of the ghost within my body to alter the shape of the tissue surrounding my vocal cords that makes my voice slightly fuller, more imperative. So I rely on it here, just barely bringing up a hum from my abdomen and to my throat to give me the confidence to speak. It's no secret, I realize, that the Levin Lord, that my father, is ailing. It's all, as you know, been going on for a long time. I exhale the words with an almost superstitious fear of inviting further catastrophe. However, I've helped with my father's treatment for some years, and my family has methods of abating the degradation that comes with these storms. I think I can help him restore some modicum of order to the house again, if given the opportunity to see him. I touch my gird belt and grip the flagon with the closest pouch, the one that contains the saline decoction I've brought from my workrooms. As heir, I had been entrusted with returning the weekly allotments of cleansed salt to the Sioux folk and removing a discrete portion for our family therapeutics. My father had been the one to explain each step of the procedure, how in every harvest there were salt fleas, as they were called by the Sioux men, a kind of halo-tolerant bacteria unique to the oceans of Rye. The house processors, he had said, would disrupt the bacteria's binary fission and prevent the replication that tended to make us salt-sick when eaten raw. But a critical amount of living bacteria would remain for a period of time, either to be eaten by the Sioux folk or utilized by us. And while the bacteria lived, it allowed our bodies, both Sioux folk and Levanite, to absorb some of the harsh energies of Rye's environment. "Do you see?" my father had once asked, allowing me my first view through a hyperscope. "How they create a conduit in their outer membrane to accept electrons, giving them these characteristic luxophilic properties." I pretended to understand, but in those early days, each time I failed to separate or collect the bacteria, I mostly remember the disappointment in my father's face, and later when he communicated only through Isa's speakers, monitoring me from the solar in his voice. "No. How will you ever get this right? How will you take care of yourself if you can't even do this? What is wrong with you? Why can't you do this?" And something about my plan to treat my father with the saline decoction similarly seems to disappoint the Sioux folk in the reading room, even with the glints of ghost in my voice giving me an added edge of command. Trun looks to his fellows, whom I notice are now wearing gloves of unrecognizable material, like stone, but upon closer inspection more flexible, and they each put something on their faces like a darkened pince-nez. Their hands are on me next without any warning. Together, they throw me flat and against the floor, and it happens so quickly, so intentionally, that I can't meaningfully conceive of what they're doing, what they're daring to do to me. "What is this? Stop! Release me, or else!" I see now. I perceive them, all of the Sioux folk, as being as much a part of the manor as Isa's background operations, but I recognize now in this coordination something I should always have feared. Because in the end, what is my father, what is my family, and what am I if the Sioux folk of the house in their collective entirety decide otherwise? I soon feel the light and heat I contain in my ichor pouring from my skin without restraint, then the glare of the ghost as it envelops the reading room, and a few of the machines on the shelves spark and burst. Yet somehow the Sioux folk atop me are unaffected, with an unsettling calm in their eyes, behind the darkened glass on their faces. And those gloves gripping my limbs, whatever substance they've used, it seems to prevent my ghost from passing from the air and into their flesh. I shout curses, commands, even warnings that they will suffer. But they speak with each other, not me, which is when I notice the painted suit woman again. The digital portrait. Her eyes shift just slightly, indicating that Isa's program has resumed functioning within this room. "There." Tron raises a knife to my abdomen. In the abdicator's renderings, they're Levanite hearts. They would be somewhere in there. If we can get them intact, then we'll have what we need. Panicked shouts rise from the outside, from the main library. For a moment, I think someone, perhaps some remaining loyal Sioux man or retainer, might be aware of this treason and upon following a late-conceived plan, might be coming herein to afford me rescue. But instead, shadows hurry past the tinted glaze of the reading room, dozens of Sioux folk moving from one end of the library in a panic for reasons none of us inside the room understand. Still, this gives the moment I need to shout to Isa, who I hope will remember and interpret my directions. "Isa! Broem!" Feedback screeches when Isa plays the old colony recording in incoherent fragments, and it's sudden enough to startle several of the Sioux folk holding me. "Come to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Welcome to the research colony of Rye. Your work is of great value to us. Well..." The salt worker nearest my shoulder loses his balance, so I'm able to grasp him above the glove, my fingers wrapping about his exposed, finned flesh so that the current of the ghost can flood his nervous system, and he looks down aghast, a flicker of consciousness of the impending consequence before his eyes and mouth ignite like suns. The The concussion from his sternum upon discharge causes Trun and the others to scatter, some tumbling into the shelves and machines, others to the sidewalls. And in the confusion and noise, now that I'm free of their weight, I manage well enough to stagger away. But the commotion, when I make my way downstairs to the main gallery, is greater than what I've left in the reading room. Sioux folk trample over one another in a furor to find another exit from the library market. Beside the shelves and the stalls, motionless bodies litter the floor, including a xanthus mound with a wisp of a beard. And across the stamped and smoldering fire pits, I can barely see a shape which I do not recognize until it looses a scream. A unique sound I've heard but once, in the alcove, when I was told of the storm. The little creature, no longer as little, I observe, has changed much since our recent encounter. Last it resembled something of a child, now it at least the height of a grown Levanite, and its appearance somewhat lengthened and finned mirrors the Sioux folk from my perspective, yet drained of all color, like a bleached shore shell or ceremonial bone. The ferine intruder lifts the limp, lifeless Sioux bodies to itself as it advances, feeding them into a large second mouth across its distended belly. All in the horde around me burst from the library market in that pressure of limbs and bone, and we share in this together, whatever else may or may not separate me from them, an unmistakable terror and the desperation that erupts from within it. Tea room and interstices. By the time the crowd disperses through adjacent compartments, giving enough room so that I no longer need to guard my chest and keep my head high, I can see many of their dead surround us, dozens crushed against passage walls to the point of suffocation. Their slack bodies pile, many fallen beneath our feet, with no one able to bend to carry them. Crying, shouting, and gasping continue as we spread apart, and I'm still gathering my breath when my eyes meet another's across the mob. I recognize the sister retainer, my claret-robed companion, and she climbs up on a cart, knocking aside ceramic servingware to make room for others to get above the throng. I try calling to her, but my words are swallowed by other voices and thunder booming about the house. Then, under the beating of rain against glass, under the panting and the feet crunching, under all of the tumult, somehow I feel it, the sensation in my abdomen, Levanite hearts quivering at the sudden chill passing through the house, and I have only a second's awareness before the Sioux folk and I begin to shout at the others in the doorway. "Get inside!" I scream. "All of you inside!" The sister retainer, perhaps because of her familiarity with my family and how they operate the manor, understands, and she begins desperately pulling at everyone at the threshold of the compartment. My father's mind turns from the storm above to the house below. Perhaps because he's finally sensing the violent creature in the library market and the threat it poses, or the chaos of the crowd, all of that heat and sound agitates whatever subliminal operations of his mind ceded to the house's configuration. But the connecting passageway we've come through, still full of Sioux folk pressing into the next room, shudders, and a bright line forms at its center, first at the ceiling, then down the sides of the passage, then across the middle of the floor. I wade through arms and elbows to the edge of this compartment, joining the sister retainer and grabbing whomever I'm able to reach. Children, harvesters, merchants, artisans, builders, any Sioux folk I can get through from the hallway and onto this side. But the panels of the connecting passage begin to retract, detaching from one another, and many are still left when the movement begins. Those unfortunates drop into the glowing heat of the cavernous bowels of the mounds, the brilliant turning of the Bell Seebeck pulse generator beneath the island, which powers my father's stormcraft and everything within the Levanite house. I can't hear the voices above the whirring of the generator, and their bodies disappear into light. Low! To the floor! No one hears my warnings when the room turns and several more Sioux folk fall to the interstices, screaming from below as my father dreams of the next configuration of the house. And I look to the lightning and cloud crags through the glass above us, while all around metal clangs and crashes into metal, gears tick feverishly and pistons fire in an overwhelming cacophony. Each compartment rotates, slides along electromagnetic tracks around its sibling chambers, resizes and rebuilds paneling where necessary or enclosures where he deems fit. And all we can do is hold on. For now. I reach out for the sister retainer across the doorframe. And her, me. All we can do is hold on. Phantom Observatory. Watch carefully. My father points to the skyline through the glass, water, and fractured light. And where he gestures, a bolt explodes onto the lunarscape, blasting a blackened rock face well above a Sioux folk settlement near the shore. My child's mind believes he summons the lightning at first, but I notice the previous scorch marks in the cliffs and understand that he's showing me the way to anticipate repetition and the chaos of countless colliding particles. This is, of course, the legacy of the Levanite bloodline. I remember all of his and Isa's lessons, how when Rye was founded by the electrogenitors hundreds of years ago, well before we allied with the other moons against the homeworld to win our freedom, we were charged to be the caretakers of this primordial atmosphere. And I understand how, after we beat back the invasion, the storms became crucial in keeping the Heaveners at bay, a warning in perpetuity should they ever decide to return for our subjugation. Thus, the first of us, the Antiquator, sat the Solar, and at the appointed times that were maximally calculated to rebuff approaching visitors, would stoke the pyres of the generator and rekindle the turbulent storms around our world, as did the next Levin Lord. Then the next, then on and on until my father, and one day, me. And yet, in studying here with him, I begin to question. It's the gray along my father's temples that does it, I think. And the radiation scarring of his skin down his throat and collar is pronounced like weeping leather, hanging loose from his body. One of his arms, too, has ceased being capable of flexion or extension, but he keeps that side farther from me when he can. How long, I think to myself, must he bear this burden of generating these storms? And when is it my turn? How long must I? I wonder. Or wondered. There's disorientation, confusion in the timing of this moment, and I sense the presence of something unnatural working somewhere between my thoughts. Has Isa given you full access to the family works? My father does not turn from the skies. In his journals, Yom took great interest in endosymbiotic theory, the idea that simple prokaryotic bacteria might absorb others, combine to form more complex eukaryotes. He focused particularly on Rye's salt fleas and their potential evolutionary paths. But that cooperative symbiosis might be emblematic of more here, I think. Different organisms coming together for mutual collective progress. I've been through Yom's writings, and I know the journals and passages to which my father refers, but when he has these moods, when it feels like he's speaking to and not through me, I'm worried that the smallest interruption will ruin it, like a clumsy movement crushing a fragile butterfly. Whatever else you learn, I want you to remember we are the stewards of Rye, not masters. That's why the original colonists created the Levanite bloodline. Do you understand? When it comes to the colony, there are some things that no one, Levanite or otherwise, will ever, or should ever, control. I want you to remember that. Outside the observatory, as if on cue, a brilliant explosion ignites in the cloud cover near the horizon, and a crooked spear of lazulite lightning plummets to the swelling ocean, turning waves in surrounding depths white with electricity. Positive fulmination reversed in its energy, a kind of anarchic discharge that is rarer, more unpredictable, and much more dangerous than ordinary lightning, sometimes drawn to the negative charge of certain terrain. One strike could destroy any one of us, even the Levin Lord, without any notice but a flash. And upon seeing the lazulite, my father smiles at me as if to underscore his point, and it is in the smile I understand the falsehood of the moment, that this is some conjuration despite its seeming reality, I begin to feel another presence in my mind permeating from elsewhere. But I continue to study the flurry of lightning and formation and reformation of the clouds like this, with him, for as long as it lasts. Illusion, though this may be, I want to enjoy sharing this time with my father just the same. The Minstrel's Gallery. It feels strange to be in the observatory one moment and slowly to wake to shapes and colors that are difficult to decipher the next. It's actually a melody strummed in the distance that my consciousness fully grasps first, followed by a voice tittering and warbly, almost as though it's amplified by a horn. "So sorry, little Agnet," the voice says as I begin to stir. "What a strange commotion out there. Had I known you were among the rabble, I'd never have induced Delta. But you were within range, and so... A face comes into relief, much larger than any of the Sioux folk, so that even before I appreciate the features, I know it to be a fellow Levanite, and gradually I begin to recognize my demi-cousin, much older than I'd last seen her, though hiding it expertly with paint and powder. Seeing Diane here comes with more than some surprise. She and I had not been in contact since my naming ceremony, at least, that quiet afternoon in the Keep of Remembrance, when I had been formally elevated to heir apparent years ago. My father had filled the pews with our Sioux folk retainers, I remember, and the other Levanites had also been in attendance. Bhikkhu, too large to enter the connecting passages, watched via screen, and I'm told beautiful Yam monitored the proceedings from wherever it is he secrets himself. Diane, though, had been visible at the very foremost seat of honor in a gown that took a dozen retainers to carry, as I recall. Even on our limited interactions, I sensed she did not miss the opportunities to make appearances, an air she still very much has about her now. There. Diane pats my cheek dramatically and wrinkles her face. "You'll be woolly for a while, of course. The thalamus and basal gang will be sore, and your hippocamp will need a minute to recover. But it'll come." You... I'm still having difficulty extrapolating her individual words to their natural conclusion. You used your ghost against me, my mind. That's why I was imagining... seeing those strange things. I what? Used what? A ghost? Diane laughs, but her eyes widen as though she's offended and concealing it. Spending too much time with those superstitious Oceanids, I think. She points with the end of a cockade fan. Here, have some of the hippocras. The spices in this fabrication are delightful. Some cinnamon, I believe? Yes. Go on, try. I see now, on a trestle table before us, a series of tiered cakes and smoked meat dishes, which she's carefully arranged. And through the nausea and fogginess, I do manage bits of food and drink, and it does seem to help my body through some residual effects of the illusions. It also gives me time to study Diane's large compartment, which I've never encountered in my wanderings. A gilded room still powered and brightly lit despite the outages, it seemed, at least for the time being, with rows of marbled pillars and a balcony slightly above us. It's there at the upper stage that I notice the source of the music that held my attention earlier, some kind of plastic menuation shaped like an elongated sphere, with 4 implements drumming away at a modified gittern. I know what you're thinking, but its robotics are of the first order, less than 1,000 commands, not even mapped from a living model like you-know-who, your father's favorite in the sculptures. She gestures with the fan at the stone faces molded near the rafters. Anyway, do you like it? He's very expressive with his third movement, pre-homeworld music, practically prim space. Have you heard Hyun Richter before? Well, you see, this is why I tell your father you should have family around, exactly for things like this. But you know him, always so secretive with you. For years, we didn't know you'd been cloned even. poor thing hidden away from us. But then, however, are you to learn? Who schools you then in the important things like finery and culture? The Oceanids? Well, Isa teaches me. Ah, well done, Mr. Egglesby. Just beautiful. Hold on. I need another drink. At the snap of her fingers, a Sioux woman appears with head low, and it takes a moment to recognize her face. It's her, the sister retainer from earlier, my companion through the storm. I want to say something to tell her I'm relieved that she survived the realignment, but she acts strangely distant, as if she doesn't know me. Instead, the sister retainer proceeds to an octagonal box in the corner, pressing various inputs before a small screen flashes. She retrieves from the box another glass of Hippocras, identical to the one Diane holds. You see this? A perfect fabrication of the underlying organic material based on stored energy patterns. Exceedingly rare, these devices, since we both lost touch with the duplicator colony, you know? Diane preens a bit in the reflection of a copper pitcher. Your father doesn't care for synthesized food or other such delights. So it is to my own benefit, I suppose, They had one, too, I mutter absently, remembering the device in the reading room. What? They had one, too, the Siouxmen in the library market. A replica, maybe. Diane gulps the synthesized wine once handed to her. They don't have the intelligence or resources for something like this. But the more I study the box, the more I insist, and I describe the strange arrangement within the reading room, where the machinery was kept, as well as the unexpected assault by the salt harvesters that followed, almost reliving the experience as I recount it to her. I believe they, some of them, that is, intend to rebel against the Levenites or are already rebelling. And the more I rethink the event, the machinery, their foreknowledge of how to inoculate themselves from the efforts of my ghost, I wonder if perhaps they aren't receiving assistance. I begin to form vague suspicions as to its source. My thoughts return again to the creature in the library market, its destructiveness, but also its seeming arrival at the moment the Sioux seemed ready to overtake members of the family. I can't believe they are wholly unrelated. Diane, meanwhile, doesn't appear to like the implications, like a foul cloud's beginning to drift over this perpetual party of hers. Oh, the Oceanids agitate every generation or two, that's true. But it never really lasts, does it, Nee? She waves the cockade at the sister retainer, then clears her throat. Their comparative lifespans are so short as to be effectively meaningless. In a handful of years, this generation of Oceanids will age, sicken, and wither away to be replaced by the next. And it's the Leven Lord and his kinsmen who will continue on and proceed with the productive work. Protecting the house, generating the storms above. One of the many advantages the colonists of the Rye accidentally engineered in the Levenites. Our longevity. We remember. Other shorter-lived beings forget. You'll see, obviously, when you sit the solar soon. I'm unsure what she's referring to about the Sioux folk or otherwise. Well, I assume that's why you're here. You have my confidence, of course, and whatever you may need for your impending ascension. My cheeks warm and I shift uncomfortably at Diane's underlying suggestions. My father, he just needs assistance. That's why I'm here to administer his aid, nothing more. And to clarify, I remove the flagon of saline decoction from my gird belt and place it on the table to show her that, with appropriate attention and treatment, he'll be fine. That's the only reason I'm seeking the solar. My father will be fine. But instead, Diane looks at the bottle and then to the sister retainer, who continues to avoid eye contact with either of us. Nee, could you be a dear, please? And, well, you know... The Sioux woman retrieves something from a side table drawer and places it next to Diane, a flagon identical to my own, celadon glazed with markings I alone make on the materials from my workrooms. How did you... My mind races at first with conspiracies and accusations, thoughts of Deanne stealing from my compartments or perhaps using that synthesizer of hers to copy the decoction, to upset or unnerve me, as outlandish as I know that seems. But given more time to study the identical flacons before me, a deeper understanding of the situation, or rather, a long-held fear of mine that I'd periodically buried, begins to surface again. All that time apart from my father, with the visits to the solar becoming fewer and fewer, and his insistence that I deliver the decoctions through Issa's dumbwaiters and pneumatic tubes, part of me had already suspected he'd long stopped taking his medications. And he hadn't told me, either because of some willfulness, or more likely because his condition was at a point where the decoctions were having less and less effect. You know how this goes, Deanne clucks her tongue. I've seen it myself when your father ascended and became the Levin Lord, the way things were with his father, how things degenerated at the very end. The minuetons, metallic implements, slide across the wooden neck and brush against the strings. I sit awash in disbelief at the notion, long anticipated but seemingly ever distant. Could my father really be so close to death? The idea that he would not share this in confidence with his son, or deign to warn me that the house would have to endure with his impairment, frightens and perhaps even angers me the more I consider it. There's a short-sightedness, a foolishness, a selfishness in hiding something so significant, both unthinkable and very much what I know he would do. Oh, this is terrible for you to appreciate fully, of course. This point that we all have reached, it seems. So I'd be remiss not to mention there are various ways one might proceed with something like this. One could certainly wait for the natural way to take its course with your father. Deanne leans closer, and I feel a strange sensation behind my eyes. And the sound of her voice, I realize, strikes me as slightly changed, almost as though if she's altered the tissue around her vocal cords to give herself a more persuasive tenor. But as the Levin Lord's infirmities advance, the modified adipose tissue around the organs, the brain, they deteriorate. It's dangerous, taxing work, operating the solar and generating the storms. And the more your father degrades like this, the more the dangers to the house, to us, all increase. So one might consider, in such extreme and urgent circumstances, accelerating the transition to its inevitable termination. At this point, I don't know whether it's my discontent with the message that makes me critical of the messenger, but I turn from Deanne and notice the sister retainer, for the first time glancing at me and toward the food at the table with a wary expression. And the more I focus, I perceive a bitterness on my tongue that feels coated, unnatural, and numb, and cannot help but wonder. Would Deanne dare to taint this food with something? I notice then, too, my demi-cousin's face is not exactly what she presents, that, under the pores of the skin and along what should have been her cheekbones, are whorls of carved grain, and around the neck and collarbone, the slightest hint of metal and microsynthetics, the signs of a falsely constructed shell of a body. Deanne is somewhere close by, I realize, but she is not at the table within this constructed Levinite proxy. And when I concentrate on the sensations within my ichor, I perceive her ghost, the field of its energy still permeating the room, giving my mind the suggestion that things are perhaps brighter, sharper than they really are. There can be no way of knowing where she's watching me from, one of the cupboards, the stairway, up the rafters, but she's somewhere else, out of reach. Your thorough counsel in this and all things is much appreciated, Deanne. My own ghost rushes to the surface of my skin, crackling and burning through the detritus of whatever's infiltrated my body and sparking against the air around me, pushing back slightly against the field of Deanne's influence. And my demi-cousin appears to receive the message because she leans away in her chair and raises the cockade as though someone has slapped her hand away from one of the dishes. We will see, I gather my thoughts, my head beginning to clear as my ghost has purified my blood of whatever she's put inside me, and I square myself firmly, intently, before rising from the table. What the storm brings, I suppose. Oh, but of course, of course, yes. That is wisest. Deanne lowers her head. Praise be his light, everlasting. Of course. Everlasting. I repeat the word and let it linger meaningfully, so there can be no confusion between us. Marked passageway. I would be lying, though, if I said I didn't think about it. Not just the prospect of my father's death, but having to hasten it. Isa says it's a socio-cultural phenomenon that predates the colonies, the homeworld, even Prim space. We imagine the deaths of our predecessors to prepare for certain entropic realities, and in placing ourselves as the executor, we give ourselves the feeling of agency, control. But I know already there can be no control. I have memories of my father grieving, mixing ash and salt to cast into the ocean for an end-of-life ritual. I once believed the ceremony had been for my grandfather, though I know now that timing does not align, and it must have been someone else we were grieving that day. In the memory of the ritual, whoever it was for, my father is wearing funerary robes and allowing the sea to froth around him, then withdraw, to spread past him again, then withdraw again, completely unaware of the frigid seawater swirling at his ankles. And with each wave, I realize his feet are sinking into the sand while he stares out at the Prasnius tide, bringing him lower and lower into the ground. So I pull at his large hand, gently at first, then with desperation, afraid that he will be swallowed by the sand eventually. But he's incapable of closing his hand around mine or turning away. That image stays with me, even as we leave Deanne's compartment, the claret-robed sister and I, to continue the journey to the Stigma Solar. My demi-cousin objected, of course, when I asked for the accompaniment of her retainer, but Deanne's desire to ingratiate herself outweighed her need for the attendant. And the retainer, who I now know is called Nee, seemed neither eager to stay with Deanne nor leave with me. But in walking the passageways, I think I've determined the reason for her distant demeanor, and in particular her stunned expression when Deanne and I discussed the goings-on in the house. You're with them? Helping them? You're one of theirs? I catch Nee's shimmering eyes, and I can see she well comprehends my meaning. Trun and his co-conspirators, the revolutionary Sioux-men, who had some intent to harm the Levenites, or me specifically. She'd effectively delivered me to them in the library market before conveniently disappearing, and it was her tenseness when I described the events to Deanne that convinced me. The sister retainer can't speak, but she holds her head level, intentionally. And I do my best to reassure her that I'm not angry, but I can see that years of serving my family have taught her better than to believe me. Still, I ask, why would you help them? Trun, the others. I would like to understand. Her answer is that she has no reason, nothing she thinks meaningful, at least. I'm not with them. Not in that way, she says. I don't comprehend their ends or intentions. I only know that they believe it is the right of the Sioux to claim the mounds. The Levenites stole something from us once, long ago. What? I don't know. I'm not sure they even know. What some ability or knowledge or way of life. Something that was once ours but no longer is. I would never say this aloud, but I wonder if there isn't a germ of truth in this belief. It is known that on Rye, each generation of Levenites is artificially created by the Leven Lord of the Last, using vats from the geneticists of Protea, from a time when the lunar colonies still openly shared their research with one another. He clones them and splices the characteristics needed to operate the household in its compartments. Electrocytic cells that comprise our Levenite hearts, adipose insulation to mitigate energies without and within, all to breed a series, one of whom would succeed him as the head of the household. But even as a boy, I had pondered the contrasting position of the Sioux folk, those who lived and died naturally in Rye's ecosystem across various settlements on our little island. It seemed they were adapted, maybe even better adapted to live on Rye, without constant and excessive artificial intervention. And if that were true, their adaptation could have preceded ours, meaning our elevated position, authority, our divinity might have derived from some of them in some way. But how? Whenever I had explored these ideas, these curiosities I'd had about the Sioux and their relation to Levenites, I found only assertions at every level, from the retainers to Isa to the accessible archives, that we are all as we are because of what we always were, like an Ouroboros riddle without any end. So I feel a modicum of sympathy for Trun and his ilk, who I assume must be grasping for the same answers about their origins on Rye, whatever those may be. Trun and his group, they never asked me for much, Nee continues. Information about rooms or the locations of the Levenites at particular times, where certain machines or books or resources were kept, how the Leavenlord operated the splicers and the breeding vats to create others in the family line, and I'm honestly not sure why I went along with the requests at first, but I suppose I did it because I thought this can't be all that there is. All that there is? The way that we live like this, all of us. There has to be more. Has to be more. Something about the way she says this makes me think of my time alone in my chambers, or the workrooms, or the halls around the Siente, if they were accessible to me, playing with the phonograph or discussing lessons with Isa, watching the settlements and folk gathering on the sands and shore cliffs at the edge of the island, questioning if that was all I would ever know. And after a moment of silence, I tell Nee that she is free to return to the other compartments whenever she wishes, though I ask for her aid one last time if she will grant it. What is the young lord's final request? I inspect the doorframe before the next compartment until I find another carving, and again, of a dog or something similar. Nee used these symbols before we entered the library, and I want to know their significance. Codes, perhaps, or some method that the revolutionaries are used to communicate with one another. No, those marks are from well before her lifetime, she says. There was a lady in this house who once cared for the Sioux folk more than any of the Levenites. Loving, compassionate, and clever above all. We called her Ami. She learned the house and its realignments had aspects that could be carefully studied. She was the first to find that between the tracks of the rooms there were pivotal nodes, such that 4 rooms tend to shift in quartets, rotating and resizing as needed depending on the concentric ring. She also understood the Leavenlord had preferences, keeping certain relatives apart or together, and each Levenite frequented specific chambers more than others. So in leaving these symbols, Ami taught the Sioux folk which areas to traverse and which to avoid. I searched my recollections of the Levenite histories, wondering who this Ami woman might be, but I'm unable to think of anyone matching these descriptions and consider whether there may be the slant of some Sioux legend at play. I'm also unsure when this woman would have lived, since the Sioux's comparative perception of time would be different, given their lifespans, at least according to Diane, anyway. Would it have been all that long ago for me, I wonder? And this, I point to the dog-shaped carving. You warned me of it earlier. What is its meaning? Those mark the grounds commandeered by your uncle. Yes. Of course. It makes perfect sense. That fear I had seen in the sister retainer outside the library now clicking into place like a tumbler. Even when my father was freer in providing me access to other parts of the house now and again, he still never allowed me through Biku's rooms. And I knew enough to understand why I was meant to keep my distance from my uncle. But Nee seems unsure of whether to share the following thoughts. No one lightly crosses paths with Lord Bhikkhu, which your father knows. So keeping his brother in the innermost rings is the Leven Lord's way of creating a buffer for his own privacy. And just as she understood my implied questions about the revolutionaries without my having to voice them in full, I grasp what she's trying to convey in turn. If Bhikkhu's compartments lie this way, then in all likelihood the center of the house, the stigma solar, and my father do as well. If I may, what will you do even if you reach him? Your father, Ni asks. You know now that you can't help him with his condition. No, I suppose I can't. And Deanne's proposal, of course, quickening things, that doesn't seem your intention either. No, I suppose it isn't. So then venturing out there tonight seems more than an unnecessary risk. Retainers, we know that you and your father are not... She stops herself just short of finishing the thought. Not in contact, she might have said, or not close, or any one of the ways to describe the disassociation brought about by my father's design. Yes, that's correct. Everything you're saying, everything you're thinking about him, about me, all of it is correct, but I don't know. This still seems something with him, that ought to be done. Sons should see their fathers when this happens near the end, I think, even if they're not seen in return. As I say this, Ni seems startled, maybe by the simplicity, the puerility of it, and I hear it too. But this is all I have, this sense that I can't turn away, that there may still be something to be sorted between me and him. I thank Ni for her help and for what she was willing to share. And for a moment, I very nearly crossed the edge of an apology for the way I had been with her. But I can't bring myself to the words, so I let them and her go. When she disappears, her absence hits so keenly that I have to anchor myself to the rumble of Rai's thunder, the timpani of the rain, and the familiar echoes of the hallways to prevent myself from following after her. Perhaps I should have said more when I had the chance. Bhikkhu's Playworks. But there's no time to dwell on Ni once I've entered Lord Bhikkhu's grounds. Within the first few steps, there is a peculiar and unsettling smell of stifling mildew, seaweed, and other things left to molder. Isa does not respond to my whispers, and with the paintings and sculptures unmoving, I can only assume her program is further damaged or no longer operable in this part of the Mons. Warped metal lines the entry corridor like a defensive barrier, or makeshift cheval de frise, so I am forced to crawl along the bent bars and towers of scrap racks until I reach a larger compartment behind it, which is when I shrink from a beam of light. There's something there, high above the scrap, that appears to be a Sioux man, based on the finned body, but his limbs seem strapped to angular pieces of metal. The light beam emanates from a fixture above his head, and he walks like some unusual, long-legged animal. The Sioux man moans as he lopes by, unaware that I'm watching from the dark. And as the light drops past his body, it reveals arms bloody and weeping, with metal and barb fusing his appendages to the elongated stakes he uses to hold himself upright. The Sioux man's cheeks, too, are worn ragged, such that the teeth within are visible through several holes, and I'm unsure how he remains living given the extent of his wounds. Further in the shadows, I see dozens more with long limbs, too, little beams of light swerving across the compartment, and I begin to feel sick to my stomach. Some of the Sioux folk had whispered rumors of this, of how Bhikkhu would take wanderers or otherwise lure Sioux to his compartments, using them in strange and unnatural experimentation. But whenever I had asked Isa or my father if there was any truth in the stories, they said, or perhaps conveniently pretended, that they did not know of such things. I suspected it was because Bhikkhu, the wolf's head, was very close to being Leven Lord once, according to the stories the Sioux folk told. After beautiful Yam, the eldest of my father's siblings, abdicated the title of heir apparent, Bhikkhu supposedly intended to take the place of their weakened father during one of the Levin Lord's last storms. But, and the stories were always unclear, Bhikkhu was either too violent or too incompetent to find his way to the heart of the house when it was most critical. And instead, they say it was my father, sometimes with the help of a young Sioux woman, sometimes alone, depending on the version of the story, who found some kind of passage to the stigma solar. He was the one to receive my grandfather's last blessing and ascended to become the next Levin Lord, to oversee the operation of the house. Some of the Sioux believed this failure at succession warped Bhikkhu beyond comprehension, while others maintained that the disturbances in Bhikkhu long preceded these events. But even now I have never known my father or the Levinites to acknowledge any of this, as if they feared even speaking of his proclivities might substantiate them somehow. There can be no question now, though, of the nature of my uncle's diversions, but there's nothing meaningful in the moment for me to do except progress past the Sioux men, trying not to disturb any of the shelves and barricades that filled the center of the compartment. I encounter other things I can't identify. The farther I go, silhouettes of bodies with too many arms or legs hanging near the walls, or what could be several Sioux men strung about with bars and cords. But I'm too frightened to confirm what any of these may be. Cruel, you think. I can feel you thinking. Cruel. The voice blends with the thunder above the house, and I stop at once, fearing my uncle has discovered my trespass. What I thought was yet another mountain of metal ahead in the compartment seems to form the outer curves of Bhikkhu's shoulders. And near the peak of the ceiling, there's a head covered in tangled white hair, lit by scattered flashes of stormlight. His hair drapes over his muscular chest and down over his seated, naked body, and his fingers, calloused and bleeding, larger than the Sioux men themselves, scrape through the heaps of metal like he's a child, pushing playfully through the mounds of dirt. Cruelty implies some kind of excess, but this, it is necessity. You just do not ken. Not yet. Under the white hair, I barely glimpse a downturned mouth, but I don't see his many eyes, so I suspect my uncle senses me somewhere in his domain, but does not know exactly where I am within the mess he's made. No, but I can find you if needs be, he growls. Your thoughts cacophonous, and I can. Just like these violators here, they can, now that I've fixed them. Yes, they can. One of the altered Sioux men in the distance bends his arms in a painful, impossible position, and I can feel the Levinite hearts in me shifting, sensing Lord Bhikkhu's ghost spreading everywhere. I realize the field generated by his body is even within those Sioux bodies, spreading their limbs apart. I almost shout and reach for the nearest Sioux man, but I'm afraid of drawing my uncle's attention to my location. You stink of their kind, Nephil. Stink, just like them. Bhikkhu's ghost releases the Sioux man, who shudders and proceeds to stalk the metal hills about the compartment mindlessly, and my uncle returns to casually pushing aside the scrap about his feet. To think the next Levin Lord, raised by servile violators instead of his flesh and blood. And for what? There's a bang somewhere that I mistake for more of the world storm above, but it's too hollow and too close to be coming from the howling of the squall surrounding the house. Ah, yes, you hear them, coming to visit us very soon, and I welcome it, in fact. Bhikkhu lifts an iron rod about the length of his upper torso and grips it with both hands, as though testing its strength. You will see, I think, what your father's indulgence has wrought, and why my work, despite what you think, Nephil, is not cruel. Because like insects, they live little lives and die little deaths, and too quickly they forget their place and ours. So we needs teach. We needs teach. That's what your father fails to undertake, to teach them that we will not be their helots and serve their kind as we once did. Let's make them, Ken, Nephil, you and I. Then another, more deafening noise in the distance reverberates and is soon overtaken by a great and continuous rumbling. The rumbling evolves into what must be hundreds of voices rising together, and I realize now what my uncle warned was coming. Just as a massive crowd of Suffolk in Xanthus cloaks rushes into the compartment and at my uncle from every direction. From my vantage, I can see each of the Sioux harvesters carrying some kind of pointed pike-type weapon, mass-produced, I suspect, by the co-opted duplication device they kept in the library market. The first of their armed vanguard very nearly crashes into my uncle's legs but his giant hand drops suddenly, crushing many of their small bodies between his fingers as he giggles. I feel his ghost at work, too, through every corner of the chamber, as a multitude of his long-limbed partial Sioux creatures gambol forth, slicing through Trun's men and pinning their bodies into the metal stacks. Why do you not teach, Nephil? Your pity and sympathies unearned, but they do not wish us well. And in my hearts I can feel Biku's revulsion and bewilderment that I take no enjoyment in their suffering, even though he is correct that these Sioux men intend only to harm me, as they previously shown. Still, it is not in my nature to hate them in this, his way, and it never will be. I'm almost certain. But the thought vanishes as I'm very nearly trampled by one of Biku's metal playthings as it runs into a group of the Sioux, and to my surprise someone pulls me narrowly out of harm's way. It takes several seconds for me to realize, from the shimmering eyes, the claret robes, that the sister retainer, Ni, is with me, here, again. Safety is of preeminence, yes. I grab a hold of Ni's hand gratefully. I can scarcely believe she's returned, and I wonder, did she discover the revolutionaries' assault and come to warn me of the danger? Or did she perhaps have misgivings about leaving me to cross Biku's compartments alone? There is, of course, no time to ask the sister retainer what caused her change of heart, but we hurry now, together, to the other side of the compartment, past Biku swinging one of his metal bars and crushing the salt harvesters into the wet floorboards. I notice my uncle's laughter only stops when something else drops on him from the ceiling, something I recognize from the distinct and unusual scream it releases. The bizarre creature from the alcove in the library market I see has found its way here again. This thing, this house intruder, lunges at Biku's neck, and with the flashes of the storm, I observe that it's larger, faster than it appeared when I last encountered it. The part of the creature that I had thought Sioux-like, the finned and elongated upper body I remembered from the library, is now flaccid and shriveled like a vestigial appendage. Instead, the second mouth on its distended belly protrudes into a long mandible, which rips into my uncle's muscular shoulder, and his bellowing nearly ruptures the eardrums of everyone below. The creature skitters out of the way of his huge hand, which rakes at his collarbone. And I see that the entity has newly barbed legs below its abdomen, puncturing deep into Biku's skin as it crawls about his expansive back. I consider momentarily that the creature may be allied with the revolutionaries, aiding them in this armed assault, but the assumption is undermined immediately when it leaps and then tackles several of the harvesters, ripping and swallowing their limbs with its larger mouth. Their group pulls back in abject terror, shouting and pointing their pikes in hopes of directing the thing away from their ranks, and it leaps higher up onto metal stacks and scampers up the wall as quickly as it dropped into the fray. Meanwhile, my uncle, still writhing this way and that, bashes the back of his head into the panes above, causing glass shards to fall in torrents of rain and wind to buffet the chamber. Several jagged pieces crash onto the flooring, bisecting many of the Sioux folk and altering Sioux men below. The sister retainer and I take cover, and Biku continues twisting in desperation while the storm howls all around us. I turn just in time to see Ni falter, and before I can help her to her feet, a giant metal structure next to us tips. The weight of the stack makes it fall swift and definite, and I hear it crush her chest when it thuds to the floorboards with unforgiving force. The light leaves Nee's eyes instantly, and her arms slacken. Her hand finned at the wrist releases mine. Something drags me away, then downward, into the ground. The Venterways. I was in error about you. I comprehend that now. Darkness surrounds me such that I'm not certain of my sight, and the raging frenzy of Biku's compartment that had just enveloped me has been replaced by a silence so complete and definite that it feels like its own kind of impenetrable sound. But for the voice, I had perceived your father's indifference toward you as a flaw, but I now believe the separation between you two is to your benefit. Yes, you've been allowed to form your own opinions of the house, and this, I think, is key. Instinctually, I bring my ghost to my defense outward from my body to rush forth in a flash of heat from my skin and out into the surrounding air. And with its glare, I observe some combination of flesh and metal where there should be walls and ceiling, arrays of churning tentacular Siri drape as far as I can see. And there is a strange pale face I barely glimpse before my ghost flickers and withdraws, like something has snuffed it out to return to the darkness. Your bioelectric field will not incapacitate my nervous system, I'm afraid. Down in these pipes, which cool the Bell-Seebeck generators beneath the house, chemosynthesis is more effective a method of survival, so I've learned to splice and reform my body without the assistance of house machinery. But to my earlier point, I was mistaken about you. So please, just give me a moment and allow me to elaborate further, if you will. I've never heard this voice before, but I already know it. I've read its rhythms and phrases many a time during my hours of study, and I have no desire to remain with it any longer than necessary, so I move along the pipe on hands and knees, trying to find any edge or break that would indicate the paneling through which I had been brought. If you wish to proceed, you will need to go this way instead. A series of lights collect, and they seem to be free-floating at first, but I soon realize they are generated and projected by dripping nodules on the ends of the closest Siri. The glowing lights lead to the end of a passage that remains obstructed by interlocked roots of flesh that do not seem ready to separate. Please let me leave, Uncle. The voice, which had at one point belonged to the abdicator, my father's eldest brother, beautiful Yom, hesitates. He must realize that, if I know him, I must be aware of what he's been doing down here in this darkness, that I had already suspected that the revolutionaries had advanced their knowledge with the help of one of the Levenites, that they couldn't have reached this point with these tools and abilities entirely on their own. And, as if anticipating my accusations, Yom's guilty mind makes itself readily apparent. You know that I vowed that I would not intervene in any of the house affairs when I relinquished my claims as Levin Lord, that I chose to walk away from the Levenite family all those years ago. And you may not believe me, but I have very closely adhered to those vows. These Sioux, they appeared to have accessed my abandoned compartments and whatever I may have left there. My research and works, they use them as if they are their own, that is true. I'm sure you've observed. But even so, what these revolutionaries do now tonight against your father, against the house, goes beyond me. This is the result of numerous incalculable causes that pre-exist anything I could have done, that pre-exist our bloodline altogether. That is why I have brought you here. I would like to speak now about everything that is underway, and I want to do so in part because of the Sioux woman you were with, the sister retainer who accompanied you, what she did for you, and more importantly, what I saw within you when you were with her. It has caused me to reassess my perception of your position in all of this. When he mentions Nee, I remember it again, her motionless body crushed under the stack in Biku's compartment, somewhere above us. Those empty eyes and arms stretching forth from claret fabric toward me as Yam drew me into the dark. And I'm not ashamed, but perhaps confused by what I feel then, thinking of her. I know I should not be so affected by the loss of her, given how briefly we knew each other, and yet I am. Ni chose to return to Biku's compartments. I've never requested it of her, and there was nothing I could do about the falling metal, or the fighting, or any of what happened around us. Yes, much as Yam said, numerous incalculable causes were at play, and I only a small part of them. But somehow this line of thinking feels wrong. You know the Sioux familiarly because of your unique upbringing, the way your father made certain that you associated more with them than you did with us. You befriend them, trust them. I've observed it now, firsthand. Yam's voice interrupts my thoughts and reverberates around the piping, his lights drifting much too close for comfort. So, you must realize our groups. The Levanite, the Sioux, are not as distinct from one another as we might think. Similar genetic alterations meant to help us all survive and adapt to the harsh environments of Rai. But one has to wonder about the original colonists, the electrogenitors, the one who created the Levanites to serve them and operate the house, to generate the protective storms that surround us. What happened to those people? There are no records after the Nine-Moon War. And once the invasion of the Heaveners from our homeworld was repelled, we used our protective storms to cut ourselves off from our fellow moons, and from the greater planetary system. But why? Was it really for only our own protection, or was it to conceal what happened to the people here after the invasion? I wouldn't be so certain the Levanites were ever the true scions of the original colonists. Those people were too afraid to bear the burden of operating the house systems and the bioelectric degradation that came with it. And that's why they cloned and spliced us, the Levanites, to do this painful and dirty work for them. But perhaps in coming to Rai, and in exploring and colonizing and conquering this place, in making us strong and leaving themselves weak, they inadvertently forgot what they did. They forgot who they were and why they were here to begin with. Accidentally colonizing and conquering and imprisoning themselves within their own systems. Without ever fully knowing what they had done, you see, I have a theory that the Sioux were once our creator. It doesn't matter. I respond involuntarily, and almost certainly unwisely, but the thought of Ni still churns at the surface, making it difficult to listen to such self-involved ramblings about the Sioux, about the Levanites, about all these things long past. Some of Yam's Siri nearby in the reflected light recoil and undulate, as though processing my response, attempting to remember what these emotions of mine mean. Of course, yes. You are upset. That would be something you would feel, of course. Then, to the more pressing point, I would like to help you navigate your way to the solar, or at least give you an equalizing advantage against your competitor, if you will accept it. At first, I believe the competitor he refers to is Trun and his fellow Sioux men. I had considered that the Sioux might be seeking the solar, much as I was, and it does seem, the more I think about it, a natural advancement of their efforts to overtake the house. In looking back at their attempts to vivisect me in the reading room, talking about cutting out my Levanite hearts, I assume their ambitions must include trying to splice Levanite properties into their own kind, and eventually learning to operate the house systems independently from us. But Yam's lights pulse and merge, and within the shadows reform into a different shape, something that doesn't quite seem Sioux or Levanite when I study the imitation. I come to see that the glowing shape is of the creature, the little thing that stalked the mans from the alcove all the way to the inner ring of Biku's chambers. This Stokast, a hybrid creature, you've encountered it several times in the house. Its form seems to be changing rapidly as it adapts and moves tonight. I cannot say with certainty where it came from initially, but I believe Trun and his fellow Oceanids have been experimenting with the genetic vats, attempting to learn how to create artificial life of their own, with properties of the halo-tolerant bacteria, as well as from Su and Levanite genetic material. This is but one manifestation of their work thus far. With your father weakening, the house systems have been failing, as you have no doubt seen. So whatever means the Stokast's creators were using to contain the organism before this, it likely failed sometime earlier this evening when the house systems malfunctioned, leaving the organism to wreak its havoc on everything in its path, Su and Levanite alike. This allowed it to move, advance steadily toward the center of the house where it seems to be drawn to the generator compartments. Meaning, you will have great difficulty ahead unless you have some way to protect yourself. Yam's Siri, beyond the light image he's generated, begin to spread like parting curtains and reveal a ruptured path that leads upward through the splintered bedrock. This service shaft crosses the colonial armories, where you may find equipment that will be of use. You'll need it up there with the active storm front, because there is only one way to the solar. It will be up, above the glass canopy. Above? The lights gather along one edge of the pipework, and the face I had seen earlier floats to the surface like a kind of mask, and I recognize from the portraiture and house collections Yam's face, the old face he now presents. Serene and not much older than I am, and seemingly unaffected by the intervening years. The face does not blink, and it does not move its lips when he speaks. The last time there was a succession, when it was my father who had taken ill, he'd long ceased to being the man we'd known. He had, in his frailty, grown churlish, temperamental, and even rageful at the suggestion that his faculties had been compromised. And so he sealed the compartments that led to his solar, except for one or two that held personal importance to him and to which he wanted to retain internal access. Your father, on a night much like this, found his own way to the Leven Lord, not for power or for self-interest, but because he feared what would happen if others like Bhikkhu reached the solar first. Eventually, your father learned from a friend he trusted, a young Sioux woman who had studied the secrets of the house, what I am telling you, that by scaling the glass scape he could find an entrance to the key rooms used by our father, and through those enter the solar. That Sioux woman, she was very important to him, you understand. I had no idea what Yam was implying, but something about the way my uncle paused, regretfully, made me believe that he wanted to say more about the Sioux woman and my father, the relationship between them, but felt he couldn't or shouldn't tell me, almost as though he believed it wasn't his place to explain these things to me. And so, with this information and access, the armory, the path to the canopy, and the center of the house, you are armed with everything your father was that night, the night he ascended. You have what you need, I think, to see your objectives met. The face of the old Yam twitches about the mouth, less like a true expression and more an errant response of his former body. I am admittedly agnostic as to whether you, the Stokast, or others succeed. I'm not supposed to care anymore what happens to the house, as I promised, but I want the imbalances created by my works, the information being misused by the Sioux. I want that to be redressed. I want you, nephew, to have an opportunity to see this through, to get what you want. What do you need? So I do hope this, however late, proves enough for what you intend. And when Yam finishes, with a remnant of his face drifting among the Siri, I can almost picture the young man from the stories my father once told me, of the older brother he so clearly revered, the one who'd sit at the shoreline with my father and Bhikkhu, teaching them, always teaching from the archives and books he'd discovered, the one who, when he decided he could not bear the burden of the solar, left his place in the house and ignored his brother's cries to stay. How different things could have been for the family if he'd confronted the problems he'd had with the Levenites. This misshapen thing they once called beautiful Yam. And I realized then the importance of facing certain responsibilities, something my uncle does not have the capacity or willingness to undertake. I killed Nee. Of course. Yes, I know it. Realize it. I forced her assistance when I could have let her be in the stoma shafts, not long after she found me, and even when she could have seen to her own safety after we parted ways, she returned because of the danger I foolishly sought in Biku's compartments. I will likely try, repeatedly, in moments to come, to redirect the fault, or reimagine the inalterable in what happened, but I also know the fault attributable to me. I must accept now, I must, or else be like Yam. So I do, if just in my thoughts accept, then turn and begin to drag my body up and through the riven passageway, moving from that damp darkness where I can hear Yam speaking still, though less and less, it would seem to me. We suffer this house, these systems without a real reason, without knowing why we put ourselves in these positions with respect to each other. I wanted to have no part except to witness all of this dismantled, and I thought perhaps I was alone in this. The echo of Yam's words weakens as I squint at a blinking light, something creeping its way through cracks in the rock, indicating which way I should drag myself next. But I see now what he was doing, your father. How he loved and wanted to do right by the people here. How, in his own way, he was trying to change things with you. I wonder what the Oceanids would think if they knew their goals were already met. Bringing together the groups, collapsing our distinctions. That might be the key. He and I, my little brother and I, just different ways of trying to change the world we were given. I see now my error. Yes, brother. Well done. I see. Lost Depot. The armory, much like the rocky entry through its flooring, is ransacked by time and salt, rifle stocks and ship components and supply crates molded or dismantled into unworkable pieces. So much for Yam's hopes for usable equipment, I think to myself, pushing through the remainders and fragments in my way. It's only as I clatter by an archway that I notice an ensconced figurine lean its miniature body toward me. My lord. Isa speaks with a warped but distinguishable voice. I was unable to locate your signature in the man's and feared something happened. Yes, well, something did. I set aside various circuit boards and ration boxes, old colonial memo pads, likely too damaged to operate. I could have used your help, Isa, and I'd ask where you were, but I'm not even sure you have the ability to explain. The figurine stops moving, and an identical one at the other side of the archway, closer to me, animates. Forgive me. I was indisposed, and given tonight's strain, my processes have been limited. He is limited, but protocols have been transferred. I am with you now. What do you mean, transferred? The Levin Lord put in place the protocols in advance. Preconditions have been met, so he's given authorization to you. Preconditions? Your father's vitals are below prescribed thresholds, and he has lost consciousness. I fear he will not survive the night. Somehow hearing the words aloud from Isa makes things clearer, and my hands begin moving faster, pushing aside the equipment as I look for some service way to the upper glass escape. I feel sweat, my breath skipping, and my ghost sparking from my fingers, but a calm takes hold when I finally see it. There, covered partially in canvas. A blackened silhouette, observably shorter than a Suman and wider built for a smaller and denser entity, meant to endure the heavier gravity of the homeworld. The darkness of it is some kind of dub alloy, and the shape and angular bent of its limbs, unsettling design supposedly to put enemies at a psychological imbalance. Heavener plate armor, a suit, just as Yam said there would be, from the invasion of the colony during the Antiquitors' time, constructed to temper, at least partially, the effects of electromechanical disintegration. Nearly all of the Heaveners died in the stratosphere during their invasion, their ships from the homeworld incinerated in the turbulence of the Levanite storms. But the few that escaped the celestial destruction, the ones that managed, despite the odds, to drop down on the scattered islands, supposedly killed Rise colonists, thousands to a man. So many colonists killed at the first of the Levanites, the Antiquiter came to assume operational control of the colony. That was how we, the artificial beings who were once created to suffer the pain and degradation of operating the Solar, came to rule the house. This armored suit was the equalizing advantage to which Yam referred. I touch the chest plate which separates, and despite being of metal, seems to peel away like the skin of a fruit, reactive and organic. The interior is lined with translucent biomaterial, and I back into the shell of it, feeling the lining and outer carapace close in around me, expanding to fit my taller form. Isa, my voice echoes to the helm. Can you patch yourself to this? I will need you both in the house and with me above the glasscape. It would be inadvisable, my lord, operating protocols of intrasystem consortium equipment, the Heaveners, are second order, and I am not permitted to have such a level of function. It's inadvisable, but not impossible, I reply, understanding Isa's hesitations. The original colonists of Rye feared higher autonomy in their machinery. They had concerns, supposedly, with one of our fellow moons, and changes undergone by the master roboteers there. It was in part the reason for the breeding of the Levanites and their operation of the Solar, which ensured some form of manual management of the electro-generation. But I have no interest in such ancient concerns. I'm requesting that you do so, Isa, and I now have the authority, so please. The figurine pauses, then extends a stone arm to touch the dub gauntlet, and within the helm, I start to see her program combining with the embedded protocols. Isa reads my pupils, my facial expressions, then rapidly she interprets them before I even articulate my next commands. In the visual interface of the visor, she draws my attention to a service ladder that leads to the rafters and beyond, toward the upper hatchways of the house. Before I leave, I touch the helm, which separates along invisible seams around my mouth with Isa's prompting, and then another panel separates near my gird belt, where I grab the flaken, the little celadon container I'd been carrying. Looking at it now, I think of how foolish it was to have believed this was ever going to help my father. But I consider it may still have its uses, and I drink, feeling the chill of the decoction working its way within and attracting and metabolizing the excess energies of my hearts. An extra safeguard for what awaits. Then, sealing the armor again, I turn to grab the first rung. Then the next, to ascend. Then the next, until finally, I meet the sky. Spirefield. Chaotic swirls roil in the nakedness of the unrestrained Levanite storm all around me. Along the rooftop, everything at my eyeline is sheeted, whipped about with opaque rainfall. But above there are streaks and ruptures, columniform sprites puncturing the ocean like cerise pillars. In frozen stretches higher still, verdant cracks spread like stellar forests, and beyond those, cerulean jets rip to space like beacons of vertical fire. Almost immediately, I stumble, beaten about by the walls of wind, and it's only with Isa's assistance that I'm able to balance enough to advance on my knees, one stretch of glass, then another, holding out a dark gauntlet to feel through the cascading water. Then a light suddenly explodes nearby. A spire, one of hundreds spaced about the canopy and connected to the house's grounding system, burns for seconds before the electricity dissipates. An initial defense against the lightning strikes, but one that isn't guaranteed to protect me up here on the open glass. Isa highlights the observatory, rising above the solar and the therm visor display, barely visible at the center of the house. And in front of that, she flashes to indicate an area corresponding to a single compartment that must be unsealed, just as Yam had predicted. More spires burst and sizzle under the rain when I press onward, and then suddenly I'm forced to look away when there's a blinding pulse from the observation tower, rising up and into the fiery clouds. I suspect the Belle Seebeck is pumping more of its dual beams into the sky, tearing the electrons from the atmosphere, oxygen and nitrogen, with filamentation resulting in the plasma and instability above Rye. It's at that moment, when stunned by the burst between the house and heavens, that I'm rammed in the back with a force so great and precise that it would have snapped my spine had I not been wearing the armored plates. My body flies across the wet glass, banging and tumbling before crashing into one of the spires, which stops me with an opposite force against my core. I gasp desperately for breath after the impact, and I hear screaming beyond the thunder, that strange and frightening noise again. Caught in the pounding rainfall and heaving under the weight of its now enormous body, the creature, the Stochast, has returned. Its mandible, in what was once a stomach, now juts outward and partially open like it's tasting the storm water, and above that seems to be a chest. I observe now 6 growths like partial Sioux faces that never finished forming their bones. I count at least 12 segmented limbs with jagged points planted on the metal frames, between the glass panes, and the legs begin rapidly tapping as the thing lunges ahead. I barely register that the Stochast is charging at me again, and only just rise to plant my feet before it rams me once more, this time at an angle at my ribs, several of which I feel snap before I'm launched sideways across the canopy and slammed upon my back. The lights of burning spires and torn colors of the sky spin and double, and in my daze, I feel something grip my leg, vice-like, with immense pressure that should have torn my flesh from the fibula. The creature tries to snap through the plating and break off the longest, nearest extremity it can reach, and I fear that it may have the force to do so if given a few more seconds. Reflexively, my hearts convulse and react to the threat, and I feel the ghost heat spilling from my eyes. Isa, quick to prevent eternal damage to the Heavener suit, opens microvents in the palms of the gauntlet, allowing small, sparking streams of the glare within me to burst into the face of the creature. The Stochast recoils and drops me to the glass, like it's been bitten by some insect, but does not seem overly concerned with the surge of energy. If anything, it seems intrigued, baited by it, and the large mouth in its lower body opens eagerly again to try to lock around my arms. But then the Stochast stumbles. Not because of anything I've done, I realize, but because a seam in the glass beneath us is pulling apart, and I come to see I'm moving from the creature in turn. Metal creaks and bangs under the boom of the thunder as the Stochast slips and tries to engage its pointed legs with the surface. My father, some part of him at least, is moving the house again. I regain my balance and, scanning through the rain of the observatory, watch carefully the sections of glass and metal rafters below. I remember Nee describing the quarters of compartments, the pivotal nodes between tracks somewhere beneath the house. If there are some sections that move together, I might be able to predict which will turn or slide on the tracks. Isa seems to be interpreting my eye movements and assists with the analysis, indicating on the display one possible path over a stretch of glass between a compartment and an adjacent set of rooms about to revolve. Then she highlights the final quadrant that appears not to be moving, then a direction forward again to another sliding set that is almost to a halt. I hobble as best I can across the glass, gripping my injured chest and breathing shallowly as I progress, vaguely aware that the Stochast behind me has been thrown off balance yet again by another turning. It screams differently then, an entirely new sound, one of desperation and unexpected pain, when several of its many legs are jammed between crossing sections and then torn to shreds by the pressure. I'm almost to the unsealed compartment, a hatchway visible near the glass, when I sense the Stochast beginning to run unevenly, dragging itself against the wind. I look to the observatory, to the skies, to the moving synchrony of the pieces of the house like incomprehensible clockwork, and I'm struck with a kind of exhausted awe and a sense of certainty. If I run again here, if I flee, the thing lurching closer will only follow, and it will come for me and others as it has before, advancing with an unmistakable destructiveness. Only I can decide now if it will be any other way. I must decide. It's so clear to me now, much like the dark shape near me, newly revealed in the bright blaze of the cracking storm, another spire that I begin to climb. Isa, can you still access the grounding system? When I command, I want you to reverse the charge and direct it to this spire. Predictably, she warns of the dangers, the shock that will come of running the house's power in such a manner when I am still on the spire myself. And at my ankles, I feel one of the Stokas's pointed legs scraping my plated calf, grasping at me as it yanks itself higher, higher, following me rapidly, mindlessly. We rise, half gripping each other, half gripping the spire, almost at the peak point, still sizzling with heat from a recent strike. And as the giant mandible closes around my torso, its tightening teeth pressing against my cracked ribs, I manage to whisper, "No, Isa, no, please. Isa, no, Isa, please. No, no." There's a small spark in the suit and a flash of light through the Stokas as the currents burn through us. And, as I suspected, the thing's natural proclivities, whatever properties it shares with the halo-tolerant bacteria of rye, seem to absorb, almost eagerly, the flow of power. It is not deterred or damaged by the reversed charge. But it also does not see or anticipate, because, as I was once taught, what follows cannot ever fully be in any sense anticipated. From the distant clouds, far above, the lower churn, seeming to begin at the skyline and traveling at an incomprehensible speed for miles across the swells of the Prasnius tides, nearly horizontal with the lunarscape, a burning, positively charged branch of lazulite lightning, splitting, dividing, and snaking through paths of least resistance and all of that turbulence toward the negative current in the spire until that massive burst of energy pierces the metal structure of my body and the Stokas' shuddering mass, and everything explodes before we plunge together through the fiery air, turning past shattering glass. We crash down. Her chantry. The elderly Sioux woman who used to visit my compartments once nursed me through fever, a childhood sickness that I think nearly killed me, though no one would admit how close it came. It was always her for some reason, no matter how many retainers my father rotated through and changed. He was one of the few who saw to me, always. I remember, too, during a particularly bad bout of illness and my bleary weakness, how she would pat my forehead with a wet cloth and distract me from the pain by telling me stories about the house, about my father, and all that came before. She spoke once, I remember now, of the cosmid lotus, whose components formed a critical part of the splicing process in creating the Levanite bloodline, joining dissimilar genetic material between species. The beauty of its engineering, wrought from so many different living plants from Prim Space, Civ Space, the homeworld, the colonies. And within it, the sepal, the petals, the stamen. She'd note the uniquely concocted structures, such that no matter the damage or method of recombination, the lotus knew to reform, to grow around itself and keep growing for its survival, always opening and reaching for light and life. Like the man's, I said, imagining the moving compartments and rings around the central compartments. Our house. And the Sioux woman touched my forehead so softly and comfortingly that it reminded me she had done so this way many times before. No, like us, little one. And through the fog of that memory that clears to make way for the present moment, I painfully regain my senses within the cracked remnants of the Heavener armor, rain falling softly down along the curves of my forehead and about my exposed chest. Isa speaks, her voice echoing from somewhere above, telling me that the properties of the biogel within the suit and its extreme method of compensating for impact helped me survive the fall through the glass and along the beams, so that we slowed barely before we hit the lower level. The suit itself sloughs off me, the metal unfolding and crumpling like deadened skin, already severely damaged by the lazulite lightning and then fully destroyed, no doubt, by the final impact. The armor, the saline decoction, my leavenite blood, one or all may be the only reasons I survived. I turned my head weakly to see the body of the Stochast, completely devoid of its ferocity and screams, just pitiable, quiet. The eyes of the Sioux faces above the mandible, open and sightless. I'm filled with an unidentifiable feeling, looking at the creature. When the lazulite burned through the spire, through my body and this thing in unison, I thought I almost felt something of the creature's ghost, if it ever had such a thing. A strange instant of understanding that there was a likeness, something similar between us. An inexplicable sense that, but for various circumstances and events beyond our control, this hybrid being, this experiment, could somehow have been me, or perhaps the other way around. It was a knowledge that our differences were ultimately meaningless. The flesh that held my being, that built itself around me, was just another housing. The Levenites, the Sioux folk, the bacteria, the Stochast. Much as Yam said, we were closely aligned with one another, not so distinct, these groups, only slightly different encasements of our energies. I find myself weeping all of a sudden, without reason, and can only barely bring myself to sit. Beyond the smell of the creature's burnt flesh and the singed machinery in ruins, there's another scent, familiar, and the dampness of the rain, that no doubt brought those hazy thoughts of childhood fever and that elderly Sioux woman. Hundreds of cosmid loti grow here, in recessed puddles and cracks in the wood about the ground, stretching to open toward the storm water. And I see better that this room, the unsealed compartment where my father must have gone when he wasn't in the solar, looks to be some kind of small chapel with an altar, a raised pond of some sort where the mass of the loti collect. Some of them as large as bodies, a beautiful quiet space where he must have gathered his thoughts when he wasn't operating the house systems, a compartment that must have some tender emotional significance for him, though I'm not sure what. I would stay here longer, among this too, as my father must have done frequently, but there's still more to do and little time to see it done. So bringing myself, injured but intact, to the door, I review the compartment, the Stochast body surrounded by water and flowers under the light sheet of rain. Then with every painful breath, every step, I go finally where it is I need to be. Stigma Solar. Like so many unseen places, the solar before me feels less imposing than the shadow cast in my memory, and smaller still, my father lies there, the center of the domed compartment. I have trouble recognizing his face after all these years. There are similarities to the father I knew and this man, in the eyes and the nose, but many of the features are nothing like what my mind expects, like some shrunken person who could be another one of his Levenite siblings. But the longer I stare, the surer I become that it's him. It is my father's frail form, there in the cradle of the Solar's operating hub, bent and disfigured, the burns along his chest and his arms fused wholly to his elongated torso now. The adipose tissue that once shielded him from the Bell Seebeck's radiation as he worked to operate the house hangs over the edges of his bed like curtains of flesh. And the room still glows with heat as processes seem to be powering down and the storm appears to reach its end. I kneel next to the cradle and touch his shoulder, but his first instinct is to thrash against me, his eyes flicking in fear or some misapprehension because he either does not see or in seeing does not comprehend who I am. So it comes to me again, that trick of stretching the tissue of the vocal cords with elements of the ghost, but instead of giving my voice strength and authority, I weaken and raise it slightly. In these spoken words, I'm a child again, a boy who no longer exists except in his memory, not so unlike the father that exists only in mine. I'm here now, I say. And the change in my voice must have some effect because my father's breathing evens and a strange sound escapes his cracked lips. His eyes do not track me fully, instead hovering this way and that. But yes, he understands who I am now, I think. So we sit this way a while, and from time to time he says or attempts to say fragments of things to me. Some of it urgent, practical, about the operation of the solar, the warning systems that indicate when storms should be generated or when ships are detected in the atmosphere. Some of it, though, is indecipherable. So much like her, he mutters. You always like her. Who? But he does not provide answers I can understand. He tosses, fidgets, shouts weakly in moments when there are flashes of unexpected anger. All of it was necessary, he says, and I interpret the words as defensive, a form of preemption of the difficult questions I'm not certain I can bring myself to ask, about why he grew frustrated and abandoned me to Isa's instruction, or why he distanced himself from me over the subsequent years, or how he felt that severance could ever be justified. It's then I realized the feeling I could not describe to Nee before. The need that drove me in searching for the solar was, in reality, a hope for something from him. Not an apology precisely, but some kind of acknowledgement that being his son was difficult. Just as, I'm sure, being my father was as well. But he's so rigid and so certain about his choices that it feels as though there is no meaningful way to bridge my thoughts with his. No way forward, he says wearily. There was no way forward in all of this without Isa, not me. She, Ami, was always the one to care for you. And you know you were better off in my absence anyway. There's no pretending that it isn't true. You know that it's true. The name Izanami. Ami, I know it from somewhere, but I don't remember where exactly I've heard it before. And I think, for some reason, of the memory of my father mourning again, of him standing on the sinking sand and spreading the ash in the frothing waves. Could that have been for her? Was this someone my father cared for once? I also think of Yam then, his hesitation when he spoke of my father and one of his companions from his youth. But I do not fully comprehend what any of these pieces might together mean. My father's blood-spotted eyes roll, and his lips no longer close around the teeth. I can see it. You look at me. What's happened to me in my body, and you intend to do better things than me, I can see. I remember, too, and the solar in your position, seeing my own father at the end, thinking I'd never use the solar for the storms either. But given time, when you care enough, you'll want to protect certain things. Protect the house, too, like I did. You'll see. Then he waits, like he expects a reaction, even in his delirium. But I find there's nothing I can provide. That much of me feels numb, like I've turned somehow to stone. So instead, he asks a question, the only question he asks me after all these years, one I believe has been weighing on him for longer than he could admit. Do you think, will you uphold the traditions of the house? I hear a mix of emotions in the shaking of his voice, such that an answer either way seems bound to disappoint him. Yam had been correct, I think, that my father once aspired to change the Levenites and their traditions, the manner in which he raised me alongside the Sioux folk, the barriers he placed between me and the family so that no one figure had undue influence on my upbringing, even his own withdrawal from me, all likely a part of setting me in motion somehow. But I feel, too, a perceptible trepidation in this question, the sense that the structure and history here in the manor had still given him some meaning, that he and the Mans and all it contained are still intertwined. Dread that disregarding the past, his past, will only lead to some unspeakable catastrophe. If any doubt endures in him, it's this hope and fear in equal measure that he may be the last of 11 lords. So I answer him in the only way I'm able, in a way that does not, in truth, answer it all. I will do the best that I can, my lord. And I have no way of knowing if that satisfies my father, especially since I have never known what does. But his eyelids flutter this way and that, and he returns to fitful breathing and quiet. And I think perhaps he was right about the necessity of everything he did, because it makes this less painful than it otherwise could have been, because I've grieved my father well in advance of tonight. I lost him the first days he closed the doors between us, and every day he and I chose not to open them after. Whatever I needed, whatever I hoped to find by speaking with my father will not be found here in the Solar, and I will have to decide to come to terms with it on my own one day, or not at all, because a sense of peace or meaning will never come from him or others, I finally understand. There is no searching elsewhere for something like that. So I spend what time I can close to him, simply watching his breaths, each slower than the last, his chest rising and falling, until it no longer does. My thoughts drift to the Stokas, lying nearby with the flowers, then to Nee, somewhere still wrapped in that moldering metal, the Sioux men and Sioux women, scattered in Biku's compartments and near the library market, motionless in those connecting passageways. And in mourning them all, I find a way to mourn him among their number, all of them, together, like the light of a ghost dissipating over calming ocean's wells, or a quiet sky one might imagine or hope has seen the last of its storms. Sure. Ash is heavier than I expected, mixed with bone and pieces not fully incinerated, but crushed in the mortar, spread evenly. The processed salt becomes fine and even, and much more like the sand. When I make the walk along the service road that leads from the outer calyx, it's slower going because of the injuries. My ribs, nearly all the muscle on my limbs, and the internal adipose tissues are damaged in more ways than I care to admit. Isa queries constantly about initiating rejuvenative treatments in the Solar, and it may be the integration with the second-order protocols or my imagination, but she is more persistent and creative in her chiding of late. Nonetheless, I've set her to other more pressing tasks. She works to contact the other Levenites, one by one, notifying them what's come to pass with the Leven Lord, and what will follow soon with me. Deanne will be among the first to respond, I'm sure, eager to pledge and establish her position, if there is such a thing in the house anymore. And there's the matter of Biku, who very well may have fallen during the storm, but Isa knows I will not believe he has been lost without undeniable confirmation. I also anticipate Yam will be lured from the underground eventually, if only to discuss the transition with the rest of the family, something I know now interests him more than he pretends. And there are others, I suspect, that I have yet to encounter in unexplored parts of the house, or to learn about from the Solar's past records. Like perhaps the Izanami my father spoke of so tenderly, a name that carries familiarity and makes me think of the scent of the Cosmid Loti and the thoughts of childhood, for reasons I cannot bring to words. No Levenite in our family histories bears that name, I know, but the Sioux, I'm not so sure. Knowing what I know now, after the events of the night, it all seems less of an impossibility than before, that my father might have had a close Sioux companion. I begin to wish that I had asked him more urgently, that I had thought to summon the questions before he was gone. But I suppose there will be many things like this that I will have wished we discussed, things I will never fully understand, now that he's no longer here. The frigid water hisses at my fingertips when I bend to touch the froth of the tide. I'd forgotten what the tumble of waves was like here, at the island's edge. And behind me, at the shore cliffs, I sense Sioux gathering from the house and nearby settlements, finned bodies moving together to watch the funerary rites, as a gesture, if for no other reason. And Trun and the others are among those watching, I'm almost certain. Trun knows, I think, that the ash I hold here for these rites is not just my father's. His Sioux men no doubt told him that I returned to Biku's compartments for Nee's body as well, to come here and to lay her to rest. I would not be here without her, and could not leave her in that place and in that way. The Oceanids respect these traditions just as we do, and it may be the only reason he and his men do not descend upon me here, the only thing that may buy me future discussions with the Sioux, and what we do with the house now, and I hope to have those discussions. There will be problems, of course, difficulties that I don't foresee, conflicts that will arise with the Sioux or the Levenites, or perhaps other seed houses on other isles, which I know must still operate like our house does somewhere. Or even with the Heaveners from the homeworld, if they are still out there, should the solar remain untouched and the skies above us remain cloudless and clear. But be that as it may, I don't want to shut the doors anymore, because I understand all too well now how dysfunction and pain only thrive in that kind of silence and separation. So I will take these problems and conflicts over the quiet passageways, and in watching the flotsam of ash pulled away and swallowed by the sea, I think only of the flow between the water and the salt and the house and the skies, the movement that is necessary to carry us all forward. And above all, in the unclouded heliotrope stratosphere, I can see the vague outlines of our 8 fellow moons, old allies we've not contacted since the antiquator. And I wonder what else might be accomplished if we commit to something different, something new. More time than I expected has passed when I look down to find that my feet have been swallowed by wet sand. But I shake myself free and turn from the water's edge, facing the house again in full daylight, that mass of brightened glass and metal. Everything seems like it can be opened from down here. Everything seems like it should be opened. If nothing else, we will open it. What are your thoughts on the story? We have an afterword that follows this particular piece, so I do hope you'll come back and listen to that, along with many of our other stories left for you for the month, all thanks to your support. You can send me an email. I'm kate@clarksworldmagazine.com. I do hope you're well, all things considered, and I bid you a very fond and hopefully very temporary farewell.